Welcome back. Last night, the Senate Judiciary Committee released documents related to Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, including some of his views of the Watergate scandal. According to the AP, a 1999 article reveals an instance in which Kavanaugh said U.S. versus Nixon may have been wrongly decided. You'll remember that that decision led the Supreme Court to order President Nixon to hand over tape recordings to a federal court. And ever since, it has been referenced as one of the major cases that limits executive power. Kavanaugh's views on executive privilege are being carefully looked at as he makes his way through the confirmation process. Joining me now to talk about this and everything else that went on this past week, Democratic Senator from Connecticut and member of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Richard Blumenthal. Senator, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I want to start right there with this revelation from these documents that the Judiciary Committee has found about Kavanaugh's comments on the U.S. versus Nixon case. Do you think that should be applicable in his confirmation hearing?
It is of profound importance to these confirmation hearings. The reason is very simply that U.S. versus Nixon not only stands for the basic principle that the president must provide evidence that is relevant and cannot assert overbroad claims of executive privilege, but also that no one is above the law. No president is above the law. And here we have Judge Kavanaugh questioning whether it was rightly decided after a unanimous Supreme Court, in an opinion written by the Chief Justice, Warren Burger, who was appointed by Nixon, said that the president, Richard Nixon, must provide these tapes. It is potentially a bombshell in these confirmation hearings.
There have been some indications that Senator Grassley is not interested in forcing the executive branch to turn over more additional documents for Democrats and Republicans on the committee to review. And it's been reported that Mitch McConnell, behind the scenes, is potentially threatening to push the nomination vote until right before the midterm elections. Are you seeing the documents that you need to? And do you think that Chuck Schumer should fight this to the point that you are facing down that vote right before the election?
Well, that's a really important question, Casey. First, we have yet to see all the documents that we need, and the recent rejection and withdrawal of the nomination of Ryan Bounds, he was nominated to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, shows the importance of seeing all of the documents, because his racial comments in the course of his past were extremely relevant to this nomination, and the excessive haste in that instance and absence of adequate vetting shows the importance of seeing every single document here that we need to assess this nomination. The American people deserve it, and so far we have yet to see all the documents we need, and Chairman Grassley has yet to provide, in my view, the kind of cooperation we need. If this nomination vote is delayed until literally the days or weeks before the midterm elections, it will be the height of cynical manipulation in a vote that is probably the most important that most of us will ever cast, because these are lifetime appointments, the highest court in the land. And again, Judge Kavanaugh has indicated in the writing you just mentioned, we just discussed, as well as others, that he is an outlier in many of his views, out of the mainstream, and the result of vetting by extreme right-wing groups, such as overturning Roe v. Wade and withdrawing many of the protections under the Affordable Care Act. So we deserve every document.
What's the behind-the-scenes thinking on what kind of impact a vote so close to the election would have? I mean, there has to be some tension in the Democratic caucus between those moderates facing re-election in red states who want to be out on the trail campaigning and those liberal, potentially 2020 candidates that as we know, there are a number of them in your caucus. How is that playing out behind the scenes?
What we need to do is to bring this case to the American people about how Judge Kavanaugh has passed the Trump litmus test, overturning Roe v. Wade, eliminating the protections for people who suffer from pre-existing conditions, millions of Americans who suffer from obesity or heart disease or alcohol abuse, and many other common conditions. But the tension is really, in my view, exaggerated on the Democratic side. I think our Republican colleagues are going to have to answer to history this
But you don't have
vote
any doubt that
will
Mitch McConnell will go through with pushing this to right before the elections. I mean,
I hope not. And I do have doubt that he will.
I mean, you've watched him as
because-
closely as I have. I mean, it seems to me like he makes these kinds of threats and he follows through on them.
Casey, you may be right, but let me just say that when I go to work every day, I have to believe that as an institution, our leadership, and most particularly the Republican leadership, will recognize that we're answering not just to the politics of the moment, but to history. Every one of us will be judged by history on this vote. And my hope is that Mitch McConnell wants to be recognized as a leader, not just a master politician, a leader of conviction and conscience.
Senator, I want to change gears quickly before we have to wrap up here. But the events of the last week, what we saw with the president in Helsinki, and then what we saw in Aspen from Dan Coats, his director of national intelligence, who was surprised by my colleague Andrea Mitchell and told that Vladimir Putin had been invited to come here to the United States. Some Democrats have called for Dan Coats to step down in protest. Do you agree with those calls?
I hope that Dan Coats will stay. He is a former colleague. I know him as an individual of integrity and dedication to our country. I have disagreed with him probably more often than I've agreed when he was a member of the U.S. Senate. But he has stayed true to the mission of the intelligence community. Donald Trump likes to operate without intelligence, frequently disregarding his briefings and keeping Dan Coats in the dark, very humiliatingly. But I'm going to be supporting, in fact, introducing a resolution that will condemn any second visit by Vladimir Putin to the United States. Any meeting that rolls out the red carpet to Vladimir Putin while he is continuing to attack the United States, as Dan Coats has said, in ongoing and pervasive use of cyber, objective and verifiable evidence. That's Dan Coats speaking truth to power. I hope he stays in that job as long as he fulfills the oath of office to defend our country.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. And of course, we'll see you on Capitol Hill.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.